Okay, good. So, good afternoon. Knocking back buckthorn, and it is about knocking it back. You're not going to get rid of it. It's here to stay. Steve Eisenhower, UNH Woodlands manager and land coordinator, and Nick Lanzer are my grad students, and they've played a big role in this work. We'll talk about four things. First, some glossy buckthorn basics, some fundamental information about this invasive plant, and then can we limit buckthorn establishment? Are there ways we can limit how it comes into a site from seed? Can stem cutting be effective? Once you've got buckthorn established, there are a lot of different ways you can try to control it. Stem cutting is one way, and we've been looking at that from different angles. And then lastly, a crop tree approach, kind of a more localized approach to buckthorn control. Some folks just go through the woods and try to annihilate it, and it's very expensive to do that. We're trying to work on more selective ways of getting to release some of our trees that are being competed with by buckthorn. So glossy buckthorn, its range today, all 10 counties in New Hampshire have it. It's common throughout central and southern New England. It is from Europe, North Africa. In Europe, they call it a small tree. Here, it's more of a tall shrub. It gets up to 30 feet. Lives for over 50 years. We cut this thing near Durham, 43-year-old, pretty substantive plant, and so it's a persistent invasive. Grows rapidly. This is a 5-year-old plant right here. This about 10-foot tall plant. It's a prolific seed producer. Makes lots of these little fleshy fruits that are birds eat these and disperse the seeds. And the seeds remain dormant in the soil for at least 3 years, and I think it's longer than that, probably a decade or more. This is a seedling of buckthorn coming up from the seed. But people think this thing reproduces vegetatively by rhizomes or root sprouts, and it really doesn't. New stems from the ground are generally from seed. It's really a prolific seeder and very high seed viability, and most of the new stems are from seed. It's true, though, that if you cut or damage a stem, it'll produce sprouts, basal sprouts. But by and large, most of the individuals you see in the field are from seed. We've done a lot of work to see that it competes with the seedlings and saplings of forest trees, especially eastern white pine. We have good data that inhibits white pine pretty strongly. It also, connecting with the previous talk and the work of Matt Tarr also, who's done this, it reduces habitat for these early successional songbirds. Thicket birds are really inhibited by it. It supports a small, low-density insect community, and apparently that reduces the density and the suitability of these habitats for birds. So it has some negative effects, and people often want to reduce its abundance in their forests and open lands. It does colonize some forest types. One of our grad students, one of Ted Howard's grad students, Josh Kozakowski, showed a very strong correlation with eastern white pine canopies. It tends to form very dense populations under eastern white pine. Also under red maple, especially if the ground's a bit wet and the canopies aren't very dense, you'll see it growing pretty well under red maple. It doesn't do that well under hardwoods, and it doesn't do that well, certainly doesn't do well under hemlock. Nothing grows well under hemlock. It also grows in unmanaged open areas, and we've been looking at it especially in recently cut areas, recently clear cut or even group selection cuts where it comes in fairly heavily. It'll come into abandoned fields, old fields, and also forest edges. Some wetlands as well. It likes bogs, comes into peatlands. There are two situations where you can envision trying to control glossy buckthorn. One is where it's pretty rare, not very common at all, but there are seed sources nearby and you think it might be moving into the site that you're interested in. And so in this case, you're probably interested in preventing establishment. You want to prevent it from getting established from seed. The other situation is the classic buckthorn thicket, where these plants are 6 feet tall, 10 feet tall, and very thick, hard to even walk through. And here you want to reduce the abundance and vigor of buckthorn if you can. And so we'll talk about these as kind of very separate, very different situations, and address a couple of issues with each one of them. And so that brings us to our next point here in the outline. We're going to talk about limiting first buckthorn establishment. Site without much buckthorn on it, how can you prevent buckthorn from getting in? And we've confronted this mainly in post-logging circumstances, where we've cut down some timber, we've opened up a site, and we now have some bare ground. And buckthorn will come into that pretty quickly if it's in the neighborhood, unless you can stop it. Steve Eisenhower and I, for years, have been looking at buckthorn on the University of New Hampshire lands. And one of the things that Steve noted, and he pointed it out to me, and he's really right, is that wherever he plants, he often after cutting, especially on log landings, he'll sprinkle some, what he calls a conservation mix. It's a mix of perennial grasses that you can buy. You spread it to kind of stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. And Steve noticed that buckthorn doesn't come in very well to those patches. And it's just a correlative observation. We decided we'd test that with an experiment. And then the other is soil compaction. Steve noted where heavy equipment was being used, oftentimes buckthorn wasn't coming up in those areas. And so we decided to do a very simple experiment to test these field observations and see if they really made any sense. And what we did was created some little experimental treatments, some plots here at the Kingman farm. And these plots are surrounded by netting because we were going to be sowing buckthorn seeds. It's a terrible feeling to be sowing these buckthorn seeds, but that's what we do. And at the same time, on the edges of the field here and back behind us, there's glossy buckthorn producing seeds that birds pick up, and they can fly over and poop those out into our plot. So we didn't want any additional seeds coming in, so that's why they're screened. But we actually ran a much more complicated experiment than what I'll describe. We looked at a bunch of different substrate treatments, but I'll focus here on the two, the turf and the compaction. We compacted the soil with a regular highway soil compactor. And then we grew grass turfs using the same conservation mix that Steve uses in the field. So this is a compacted soil treatment. Some weeds sprang up, which we later removed, but this is actual thick perennial grass turf from the seed mix that Steve provided, and that we just left intact. And so you can see little flags there marking the buckthorn seedlings as they emerge. We sowed buckthorn seeds in the fall. They overwintered. They need a cold treatment. They come up in the spring. And so we tagged every buckthorn that came along. We measured its height and its growth rate and its survivorship through the season. And we have lots of data from this experiment, but I'll just show you the kind of the take-home message, which is that this is the number of buckthorn seedlings surviving 1 year. That is from May to November. And these are the three treatments: control, turf, and compact soil. And really, compared to the control, the turf had very, very few seedlings surviving. And I don't have the height data here, but they're also much smaller than the buckthorn growing in the controls. What was interesting about this was that at the beginning of the season in June, densities of buckthorn were similar across all treatments. They got established or got started equally well across the treatments, but in the turf, they just didn't do very well. A lot of it was consumption by herbivores. Insects, and we think meadow voles were in there too, clobbering these guys. And so they just really got torn up. By the end of the year, there weren't many left, and certainly the ones that were left were a lot smaller. Compact soil didn't have much of an effect. That wasn't very impressive. But the turf has some promise, I think, for reducing buckthorn invasion in sites where it's not already present. So the second control situation is where buckthorn is present and abundant, and here you want to reduce abundance and vigor. And there's a lot of ways you can do it. Some work better than others. Herbicide works pretty well, but you have to come back a second time. You can't get away with one because of that seed bank. A couple years after you do the first hit, you have to come back and hit them again. John O'Brien in the Connecticut Valley has experimented with organic layer removal. He takes a dozer and goes through these stands and strips off the top inch of organic layer. That's where all the buckthorn seeds are. And buckthorn is shallowly rooted, so he gets the buckthorn roots as well. And just piles that stuff up and leaves it. And the sites, I visited his sites, they're incredibly buckthorn free after you do that. But you're having a tremendous impact on the land. Stem cutting, very popular, but as you'll see in a minute, very expensive. Uprooting, hand pulling, forget it. And you can do it, but only on a small scale. You can't do it on a large scale. And then you can use combination methods where you use a combination of things. These all have costs. The organic layer removal, approximately $1,500 per acre. Repeated stem cutting, and you do have to cut them repeatedly because they do sprout from the base. We'll talk about that more in a minute. You can't just cut once if you want to have an impact. You have to cut several times. The cost there, it's a wide range, $1,500 to $3,000 per acre, depends on how many repeat cuts you have to do. And then broadcast herbicide, one treatment is $300 to $500 per acre, but you have to follow up, and so it's more like $525 to $875 per acre. So if you've got a buckthorn problem and you want to minimize it, reduce it, you're going to pay for it. This is not cheap. This is not cheap at all. When I show these figures to folks who really want to reduce buckthorn impact, to release trees and improve their rotation times, they just gag when they see these numbers. I mean, it makes it almost, it's just not, on a grand scale, it's very difficult. So can stem cutting be effective? Well, a lot of people do stem cutting, even though it's pretty expensive. And Steve and Nick and I, wondered about how we go about stem cutting. And when you go talk to people, and when you see them stem cutting, oftentimes they take their brush cutter and just zip along about a foot above the ground and leave all these stubs. And our observations were that when people cut low, their success was much greater. By success, I mean actually killing the buckthorn plants. And so, and this is Abby Ziedema doing a cut of buckthorn, and she was cutting about 8 inches above the ground to prevent cutting the white pine seedlings that were getting established there. She didn't want to hurt the seedlings. The problem was that she didn't kill any buckthorn. Even when she cut buckthorn 8 inches above the ground, she cut back buckthorn 4 times during the year, no effect. Buckthorn kept coming back, 95% survival. It was worthless. And so there's really great variation we see in the results of these stem cutting studies, and we thought it was due to variation in cutting height. Our hypothesis was that if you cut low, cut close to the ground, you'll have greater effect. So we did a very simple minded set of experiments. We had some experimental plantings. We actually grew buckthorn from seed, again, Kingman Farm. And in one experiment we cut plants at 8 inches above the ground and cut right at the ground, and then we had a control as well. Another experiment, we had a control. We cut at ground level 0 inches, 2 inches, and 7 inches. And then in the wild, much older plants, these are just 1-year-old plants. In the wild, we looked at 8-year-old plants, and we cut at 0, 2, 7. And again, we had controls. And the results are pretty interesting. These are repeated cuttings. So we're cutting, in this case, after 3 cuts. These are experiments done in plantings of 1-year-old plants. And this is the percentage of plants surviving after 3 cuts. If you cut at the ground level, they all die after the 3rd cut. In fact, most of them die after the 2nd cut. If you cut at 8 inches, 100% survival, and they all increased in biomass. They just produce branches below the cut level, and they keep doing that. They proliferate down low, and they all grew quite a bit. Some of them actually flowered and made fruit. So then we cut it at ground level 2 and 7, even at 2 inches above the ground, 82% survival. Unless you're close to ground level, there's no point in cutting, really. It's not doing anything. And of course, these are first-year plants. We've done this work, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in the field with older plants. And here we see again percentage surviving after 4 cuts, 2 field sites. Cutting at ground level here, only 60% mortality at McDonald lot, and at Chesley property, 93% mortality. That's after 4 cuts. These are older, bigger plants, and so they're seemingly more persistent. Now, we just did this work last summer. I predict, we go back this spring, most of these plants will be dead, I think. Their last recovery was pathetic. Little tiny stems. I think they're probably dead. So this may be an overestimate, and it may be a gross overestimate. But still, after 4 cuts, these plants are still producing sprouts. So you wonder about the efficacy of cutting at all, really, when you see data like this. With young plants, cutting low seems to do the trick. With bigger, older plants, with perhaps more of a root system, with root reserves, I don't know. Lastly, a crop tree approach to buckthorn reduction. Most people approach buckthorn control by just going out into the woods or into an open area and just cutting all the buckthorn in sight or spraying it all. And that's very expensive, as you've seen by the cost figures earlier. So Nick Lanzer had an idea. He said, instead of going whole hog with these stands of buckthorn, let's go out and pick a number of really healthy looking, well-formed white pine seedlings, and let's liberate them from buckthorn competition by just cutting a small circle around these trees. And so his strategy was to walk transects through an area infested with buckthorn, identify the healthy, well-formed pines, mark them, then come back with a brush saw and cut a 3-foot radius around each one. Just takes a few seconds. And he also brought in a herbicide person to actually, he had 2 treatments. One was just cutting the buckthorn with the brush saw, another was cutting the brush saw with the brush saw and following up with herbicide. And then look at the results. And the results were impressive. After just one season, I told Nick he wasn't going to see anything in the first season, but he saw a remarkable increase in leader biomass. This is the biomass of the pine leader, the New Year's growth. And he got a doubling of biomass in the cut-only treatment and the herbicide treatment. This is a very strongly significant difference there. And if you look at the structural carbohydrates, the stored carbohydrates in the bark, this is mean starch content of the bark. There's the control, more than doubled actually in the cut-only and cut and herbicide. So just a little bit of release from buckthorn, and these pines are really doing well. And of course, if you can give them a couple years of release and let them get up above that top of that buckthorn thicket, once they're through the top of that thicket, then they're free. And they can grow unimpeded from that point on. But the trick is to liberate them and get them up high enough just to get to the light and to escape competition with buckthorn. So I think there's some promise with this method. We're now trying to figure out what the costs of this are and how much less expensive it would be than doing a whole stand treatment, which is what's commonly done these days. So conclusions, grass turfs may be useful in reducing buckthorn establishment. Cutting height, I think, is something we should explore further. Clearly, cutting lower is better than cutting higher. In fact, cutting high may be worthless. And then a selective crop tree approach to buckthorn reduction does seem to have some promise for a less expensive way to get your trees to grow. So, questions? In the back.
We have those, and my husband cuts them every year.
Mm-hmm.
However, now I can tell him to cut them lower, but you said cut them 4 times, so how often does he go back there? Does he go every 2 weeks?
Yeah, we've been going back every 4 weeks, but I think 3 weeks is probably better. It takes them a couple weeks to really just come back from the shock of being cut. But this last summer, I was thinking we should have been back hitting them again in the 3rd week, and we waited till 4. That was our protocol. Yeah, I think if you've got relatively young buckthorn and you hit it every 3 to 4 weeks and just keep doing that, you'll kill them eventually for sure. Yeah.
He's been there a long time. He cuts them every year, but he just cuts them to get a view. So they're established, so still every 3 weeks.
I think if you cut them every 3 weeks and just start early, the minute they come up, the minute they sprout, nail them. And then every time you see just a few inches of growth, hit them again. Maybe even in the middle of the summer after a rain and they're growing a couple inches every week or two, you get them every 2 weeks probably. But if you keep hitting them, they'll eventually die. And if you just have a few plants, it's not a big deal. It's more of a concern if you've got a 100-acre woodlot with this thing in it. Then it's really expensive.
So
Yeah.
this at the beginning, but is the real concern with buckthorn that it's out competing the native tree seedlings?
Yes.
And it's also, so you show fruits, but they're not high quality food for buckthorn?
The birds, Adrian can probably answer this better than I could. They do eat buckthorn. The birds eat it. I've seen, especially thrushes, seem to like it. It isn't. The literature suggests it isn't steak for these critters. It's not very nutritious, but they do consume it. And as Matt Tars pointed out to me, and I have to acknowledge that all these non-native invasives, it's not all bad. There's a benefit too, and I think one of the benefits is they do produce a crop of fruits in the fall when birds need it, and so I think they get some benefit from that. Yeah. But it's during the breeding season when the bird densities are not there, because at that time the birds are mainly eating insects. And the insect densities are apparently much lower in these buckthorn thickets. Buckthorn has a natural insecticide in the leaves called emodin. And it really, not many of our native, very few herbivores. The only herbivore I've seen on it is Japanese beetles, which is rather hilarious. It's another invasive.
Is that why it's so competitive advantage? Just because it's not.
Oh, I think that's a large part of it. Yeah, and nobody's even looked at the soil aspects of it. My guess is that there are a lot of soil pathogens that it's free from as well. and it tends to, its growth rates, compared to our native shrubs, its growth rates are amazing. We grew this thing in the greenhouse one time, and you could barely keep it inside. I mean, it's...
Two quick questions. So my gut is one of the questions I would want to know is the time and the season to make these cuts.
Yeah.
And so you didn't really go there.
Right.
All the time. I was just wondering.
Yep.
You know,
Good question.
Hitting them going into dormancy, letting them deplete reserves, and
Yep.
then hitting them again at just as they're coming out of it.
Yeah.
Have you been playing with timing? And the other question I had is taken from the barberry eradication chapter with these larger plants, stem cutting combined with stump treatment.
Yes, yeah. That's actually the most effective way to kill these plants is to cut them first and then apply herbicide to the cut stems. That really does work very well.
Late season?
You can do it right into the winter. Yeah, in fact, late summer, fall is the best time to do that. So that's what the literature says.
They
suck it right down. Yeah, they do. Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
so in terms of timing, have you looked at
You-
that systematically?
We haven't, but one of the many plants have been studied as to the effects of cutting on their stored reserves, stored carbohydrates. And the typical cycle is that they store up carbohydrates in the autumn. In the late summer and in autumn, they're well stocked. In the spring, they use a lot of those stored carbs to build new material, and then they rebuild the stocks again. The plants that do that are all what are called determinate growers. That is, they in the spring they flush out new growth, and then they stop growing, just sit and build up reserves. Buckthorn doesn't do that. Buckthorn, it does probably rely on some stored reserves in the spring, but it is indeterminate in growth. It just keeps making foliage and fruits and flowers, and it does this continuously all summer long. So it's not clear that it's actually storing a lot of goodies early in the year. And so in theory, you should be able to hit it almost any time during the summer and have a pretty good effect on it. But the fact is that it comes back whenever you hit it. And we've done some cuts in spring and late summer and then midsummer, and we haven't done it systematically, but my overall impression is not much difference.
Bracketing the dormant season?
We haven't done any cutting in the winter.
Yeah.
No. That would be interesting, actually.
I want to thank all of you for hanging in here. Again, my goal now is to get these, with Pete's help and my undergrad, to get these up as YouTube videos and then let Lori do her magic so that we get a wider spread audience for these. But getting put up on the mezzanine this year kind of